All right, I think we're going to get started in the interest of time. Welcome back. Velkommen. Tervetuloa. I hope everyone has a chance to, or had a chance rather, to stretch their legs during the tea break. This panel now will consider the view across the Baltic. So perhaps a somewhat less feisty topic than the one we just had. And we're looking again at the Nordic perspective. So what were the Nordics' strategic stances going into 2014, for example, and how did they react to the transformative events of Maidan and indeed beyond? So to explore these and other relevant questions, we've assembled for you a formidable Nordic Avengers squad of sorts here, representing all Nordic states in the greater Baltic Sea region. And yes, we do include Norway and our Norwegian friends in that. So our discussion on stage here, as with the other panels, will be followed by Q&A. So do jot down any questions you may have and store them in your arsenal for later. I am, again, very mindful of time, so shall cut to the chase now and present to you our first distinguished panelist, Dr. Hans Mouritzen, a senior research fellow at the Danish Institute for International Studies, is also the editor of Danish Foreign Policy Review. He has developed a theory on the autonomy of international organizations, small state foreign policy, how external danger affects domestic cohesion, and how historical memory impacts contemporary foreign policy decisions. Hence, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm honored to be here. It's actually my first time in Cambridge. I'm talking, of course, on behalf of myself, not on behalf of the government, which you will understand in a few minutes. So let's see. It is, of course, difficult to analyze the Maidan events because we know what happened later. We know what is happening just now. So it's always dangerous with hindsight, and things become very much black and white, and the good guys and the bad guys. I will avoid that as the best I can. But I'll start with a small anecdote about Nordic cooperation, because that's what we are talking about here. Nordic cooperation after Maidan, because it was actually Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister, got the idea after Maidan that there should be a common Nordic manifestation in Kiev. 5 Nordic foreign ministers should take a walk in Kiev and mourn the victims and visit the newly installed officials after the ousting of Yanukovych. And this is five not so large innocent countries with a good reputation in the UN and elsewhere. So that sounded like a very good idea, actually, just also to legitimize the new officials in Kiev. But then it turned out that the Norwegian foreign minister had some calendar issues, and the Finnish foreign minister, I don't know if that was Erkki, but I don't know what, but anyway, the Finnish and the Icelandic foreign minister couldn't make it either. So only Danish foreign minister Martin Lidegaard could make it. So actually it turned out to be just Carl Bildt and Martin Lidegaard who took the walk in Kiev. I'm saying this just to show you how tense the situation was at the time, and how much. You don't need to be a cynic to interpret calendar issues to mean Russia considerations, because Russia policy was very important to all 5 countries. But anyway, all countries condemned the annexation. There that followed as a violation of international law. And Norway and Iceland joined the EU sanctions, although, as you know, they are not members of the EU. Also, there was the 5 ministers authored an op-ed, a common op-ed in selected Nordic newspapers. And I'm sure you all know, as academic scholars, those of you who are know how difficult it is to co-author an article. But here it was actually 5 co-authors, and they needed to agree on every sentence. You can imagine how difficult that may have been, but it succeeded anyway. What they said was that we could no longer have business as usual with Russia, and Russia shows discord in NATO and the EU, but not among the Nordics. Strange thing to say, because sowing discord is part of politics since as long as that has existed. I mean, government sowing discord between opposition parties and all that. But okay, that's what they said. I have spent some time in studying how European countries reacted to the Georgia-Ossetia-Russia war in 2008. And actually the same pattern repeated itself in 2014. And there I distinguish between doves and hawks, and I mean nothing normative by talking about hawks or doves or anything. But the point is that those who were hawks in 2008 were also hawks in 2014. Those who were doves in 2008 were also doves in 14. So the point is just you don't switch from the one to the other. You remain either the one or the other. The thing is just that the whole spectrum has moved itself from Georgia to Maidan. It moved towards the hawkish side, so to speak, because events were more were more unequivocal, I guess, in 2014. So, specifically about Denmark, I could say that Danish Russia policy has fluctuated quite a lot in the 21st century. You know, after the Georgia-Ossetia-Russia war, there was this push the button, this reset in 2009 with Hillary Clinton and Lavrov. The US had developed better relations again with Russia, and so did Denmark. We always do, as we are told by the Americans, as you know, so we also got better relations with the Russians. Later on, after Maidan, relations soured quite a lot. Denmark has been quite hawkish on EU sanctions in the internal EU discussions about which sanctions to apply. We have not been as hawkish as the Baltic countries or Poland, but more hawkish than Germany, for instance. So it's somewhere in between there. You can always see this spectre of hawkishness, you know, from all kinds of things. The most hawkish are always the Lithuanians, then follows Poland, Estonia, Latvia, the UK, then comes Sweden, then comes Denmark. I'm exaggerating a little bit. And then in the other end of the spectrum, we have the South Europeans, the doves. Anyway, another thing that was special to Denmark was the Nord Stream 2 ratification at the time. Because, as you may know, Nord Stream goes in Danish economic zone, not our territorial waters, so we could not refuse it, but in our economic zone, so we could make certain viewpoints on the environmental impact of this. So Denmark delayed and delayed and delayed because the politicians were not very fond of that Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, actually. But as you all know, then somebody blew the whole thing up. No names here, but somebody with a vested interest in that blew it up. So not an issue any longer. We were also, Denmark was quite lukewarm in the Minsk to the Minsk. We were not part, as you know, we were not part of the Minsk agreement in any way, but we were quite lukewarm to the whole idea, like the British also. If we talk about the comparative perspective with the other Nordic countries, and you could say Sweden and Denmark were the most, let us say, idealistic at the time. Finland and Norway were more low-key, with emphasizing continuity and pragmatism. And as I indicated, I think Carl Bildt was a leading figure for Sweden and for the Nordics in this. I don't know if he wanted to take revenge for the defeat at Poltava in 1720, but anyway, he was very engaged in this issue. The big picture here is that Maidan meant that Nordic security cooperation was intensified. We could say Georgia was a small boost to Nordic cooperation, but Maidan was a bigger boost, actually. And today, you know, it's something much bigger. But I think you could say that Norden willingly imported a Black Sea conflict into the Baltic Sea, because as far as I know, but correct me if I'm mistaken, but as far as I know, there were no bilateral issues between any of the Nordic countries and Russia. But out of solidarity with Ukraine, the Nordic countries were willing to stand up and in that sense, anger the Russians, which also meant, for instance, that Norway's cooperation in the High North, the regional cooperation you have up there, was a bit soured, but I don't know how the status is just now. But it, of course, it has had some consequences that Nordic countries have stood up there, at least after Maidan. Still, Finland kept its lines of communication as the only country, as far as I know. Finland kept its lines of communication open to Moscow, to Niinistö, and Putin had a quite fair relationship. They don't have it anymore, but at the time we're talking about here. Today, as you know, we are all united in one big boat or one big club. I will not expand further on that, but these were the times leading up to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. Our next speaker is Ambassador Christian Syse, a senior Norwegian diplomat currently serving as his country's special representative for Ukraine, responsible for coordinating Norway's support efforts there. Formerly ambassador to Sweden, Deputy Secretary General of the Foreign Service, and Director General for European Affairs and Trade Policy in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, he has also served in the office of the Prime Minister, as well as in the Norwegian Parliament. Christian, we look forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much, Trev, for your kind introduction. I will make 6 points, preferably in 6 minutes. 1. Norway and NATO. Norway was a founding member of the alliance 75 years ago today. The northernmost European ally, bordering Russia, formerly Soviet Union. So what has now then been Norway's contribution, net contribution to the alliance? Troops on the ground? Fighting aircraft? Well, some. Vessels at sea? Some. Our net contribution has been and still remains intelligence, surveillance in the high north, and we're committed to that in the years to come too. Second, as you pointed out, Trev, in your introduction, I believe, Norway is not a Baltic state. However, the sovereignty and independence of the Baltic states have always caught the imagination of Norwegians. I remember my father, who used to be a politician. He contributed to the cooperation between the Baltic states and the Nordic Council and Nordic Council of Ministers in the early 1990s. And I believe that we see each other as not only brethren, but close friends, the Baltic states, as well as Norway. Third, yes, indeed, I used to serve with the Prime Minister, and I traveled with him in the early 2000s, also to the Baltic states. They had one big ask: to join NATO as soon as possible, preferably tomorrow. We sought to caution them. The Prime Minister said that, well, this is a process, a due process that we have to accept. It might take time. One has to be realistic. But the Balts and the other Central European states, they wanted to move fast. So the traditional Russian narrative that NATO pressured countries of Central Europe into NATO, well, that was certainly not the case for my country, even though, of course, we supported the Baltic states and the Central European countries. Fourth, do we read history correctly? Prime Minister, at that time, Prime Minister Putin visited Oslo in the fall of 1999, and then again as president in November 2002. I was then with the Prime Minister on both occasions. Well, he was met with criticism over Chechnya, of course. Yet, lest we forget, the big caption read, cooperation politically and economically in any way with Russia. And for Norway, Russia was particularly interested in cooperation in the oil and gas sector, joint cooperation in the Russian Arctic North, on the Yamal Peninsula, in the Kara Sea, elsewhere. That was the wish of the Russian government. And remember, this was in the days of the NATO-Russia Council, G8 membership, and even in some quarters they would talk about Russia joining NATO. Nobody has mentioned that. Was it naive? Did we go too far? Or didn't we go far enough? In April 2010, President Medvedev visited Oslo. He walked the streets. He was considered enormously charming. He captured the imagination of the Norwegian person people. Our Prime Minister at that time was Jens Stoltenberg, and you know what he later became. Soon thereafter, we agreed with the Russians on a delineation at sea in the Barents and Arctic Oceans. A major step. A major step. The Russian Federation asked the Prime Minister for support for WTO, World Trade Organization membership, which came into force in 2012. And also the Russian Federation asked us for EFTA, European Free Trade Association, a free trade agreement. Negotiations started in 2011. However, those are now suspended. This was the situation, at least up until 2010. Fifth, on the Euromaidan, in the fall of 2013 until early 2014, and then the Russian aggression that followed. I reread on my way here my foreign minister's address to the Norwegian Parliament in March 2014. Everything being said in March 2014 to the Norwegian Parliament could have been repeated today. It's sharp criticism of Russian actions. What should we have done differently? Would it have made a difference? Should we have had, we now, West Europe, an all-out sanctions regime vis-à-vis Russia starting in 2014? Well, the view of my government, well within the restrictions set by NATO and the European Union allies, sought to carry on cooperation with the Russian Federation, hold Russia accountable, to carry on with people-to-people contact, particularly in the high north, and also to continue the limited economic cooperation between our two countries. And that was the wish of the Russian Federation too. I will give you one example. The richest cod fishery in the world is in the Barents Sea. The stock that stock is managed successfully by Norway and Russia jointly to this day. Would it be wise, back in 2014, to discontinue that cooperation? Probably not. Sixth and final. My government is a firm supporter of Ukraine, financially through the international financial institutions, militarily to the best of our abilities, and in adherence to European Union sanctions, and we are heading to European Union sanctions, etc., on Russia. February 2024, 2 years of war? No. We're talking about 10 years of war. And indeed, the Baltic states saw early what was happening, perhaps more clearly than some. Now, however, my country, we have a unanimous Norwegian parliament. Oh, I can tell you, that's very rare. A unanimous Norwegian parliament stand behind the broad-based support for Ukraine. We and others say, for as long as it takes. For as long as it takes. What takes? I'm not quite sure if you clearly define that, and this is certainly our challenge. Thanks very much.
Tusen takk also for staying so within your time. So that is, we all very much appreciate that. And that was very, very interesting. Again, we'll return to, I think, those remarks in the Q&A afterwards. Our third panelist, Dr. Erkki Tuomioja, was first elected to the Finnish parliament in 1970 and has served as chairman of the Parliamentary Social Democratic Group, deputy mayor of Helsinki, Finland's Minister of Trade and Industry, and twice as Minister of Foreign Affairs, from 2000 to 2007, and again from 2011 to 2015. So again, spanning the period that we are talking about today. A former member of the Finnish Olympic Committee and author of many books on history and current affairs, he is currently an adjunct professor of political history at the University of Helsinki and the founding president of Historians Without Borders. Erkki, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. In March 2014, I was sitting at a meeting with the foreign ministers of the Nordic countries, the Baltic states, and the Visegrad countries in Narva, Estonia, when our deliberations were interrupted by someone bringing in the news of the Russian occupation and invasion of the Crimea. We were all shocked and issued a statement at the end of our meeting condemning the unprovoked violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity by Russia. But interestingly, the almost jubilant immediate reaction of one of my non-Nordic colleagues was, well, let them keep the Crimea if they now will leave the rest of Ukraine alone. This did not happen, of course, but it showed that there were also geopolitical and historical reasoning in play, in addition to the legal and moral reasoning in assessing the annexation of the Crimea. And this led to wishful thinking that Russia sought, after the annexation, to cut its losses and acquires in the ousting of its protege, Yanukovych, in Kiev. This assessment was almost immediately shown to be wrong and was not shared by the minister's colleagues and probably neither by himself less than 1 hour later. Russia did not leave Ukraine alone in peace, but intensified its operations in eastern Ukraine while preparing the full-scale invasion aiming to destroy the sovereignty of Ukraine, which started now in February 2022. While there were certainly people also in the room that were convinced that Putin would not rein in his imperial instincts and ambitions until stopped by sufficient force, this was not the case with most Europeans who thought that the sanctions approved by the EU and the West would be enough to stop Russia. And when I earlier today raised the question, the issue of whether there were situations in the past where the West and the EU could have reacted in a different way towards Russia, it was not because I think that it would have influenced in any way Putin's ambitions and plans, but it could have influenced the way that he manipulates Russian public opinion today. And that is something which I think is a lesson to be kept in mind. Finland was obviously no exception to the general feeling. And the reaction to the Crimea, while clear and clearly stated, was rather muted, at least so far as our relationship to military alignment was concerned. Public opinion in Finland had been remarkably stable regarding our international status, and for 30 years after the Cold War, regularly conducted polls had shown that on average 60% of the people were for continuing our policy of military non-alignment and 25% in favor of joining NATO. Variations were at most plus minus 5% in either direction, showing no consistent reaction to outside events, those of 2014 included. After the joining the European Union in 1995, we have not claimed to be a neutral country any longer, and even our military non-alignment was not an ideological posture, but a description of our status as not being a member of any military alliance. The foreign and security policy white papers presented to Parliament every 4 years were prepared in Finland with the participation of all parties, the opposition included, and were approved by Parliament more or less unanimously. Two parties were early proponents of joining NATO, but did not press the issue, joining with the much bigger majority, which agreed, as expressed in the white papers, that Finland, as a military non-aligned country, retained its sovereign right to reconsider its status should changes in the security environment call for it. And opinion started to change in the autumn of 2021 as Finns reacted to Russian bullying warnings to Sweden and Finland to refrain from joining NATO. The majority was still in favor of staying out until February 2022, when almost overnight opinion swung favoring membership, support for which grew to between 80 and 90% in the spring. The government drafted a white paper which did not directly take a stand on NATO membership, but was clearly intended to gain the broadest possible consensus for joining the alliance. And in this it succeeded, as in the end the membership application was approved in Parliament with 184 votes for and 7 against. The majority for NATO consisted of people with at least 3 kinds of motives. Certainly there were many and are many who suddenly became concerned that Finland could be the next victim of imperialist Russian claims. Obviously, there had always existed a smaller part of Finns who had taken this possibility into account, but only in February did the majority change its view. Not necessarily because they saw any immediate or even long-term military threat directed specifically towards Finland, but have come to the conclusion that the kind of very pragmatic relationship we had with Russia, based on a sufficient amount of mutual respect and trust, was no longer possible, and that we might as well take the step of joining the larger Western community also in NATO, of which we are a part and have been a part always. In addition, a third group of people may have supported NATO membership because they accepted it willy-nilly as the consensual response of the Finns to the change in our security environment. I stress the pragmatic nature of our relationship with Russia, which was not blue-eyed trust. Contrary to what most NATO countries did after the end of the Cold War, we did not run down our national defense or end conscription. And this means that we are unique among European countries with the ability to mobilize and equip, if need be, a trained military reserve of 280,000 soldiers out of a total trained reserve of 900,000. Name another country which can do the same, even a much larger country in Europe. And when it became clear within a few weeks after the attack on Ukraine that Finland was going to send in its application to join NATO, it became extremely important for us to get Sweden to do the same in more or less the same timetable. A situation where only one of us would be in NATO and the other outside would be extremely negative for both of us, irrespective who was the one in and who was the one out. Why this emphasis on Sweden? Well, of all the world's countries, Sweden is the one which has the strongest own interest in defending Finnish sovereignty. Then come the other Nordic countries, European countries, the Transatlantic Alliance and so on. We welcome support from any quarter, but at the end of the day, if something happens, it is only Sweden, and primarily Sweden, which has this as its first interest. There may be other interests in play for other countries, which may override their commitment to Finnish security, and this applies to everyone else as well. We all know that, notwithstanding our alignments. So we were relieved and satisfied to see that Sweden also sent its application to NATO together with us. We were, of course, dismayed that the process took longer for Sweden than for us, but this was not primarily a Swedish problem, or the more one for NATO. And the fact that it took less than a year for our membership to be processed was due to the fact that Finland was already much more NATO compatible than some of the NATO countries. And thus there was no need for processing a NATO membership action plan for Finland and Sweden. We were recognized as producers, not consumers of security. This joining NATO for Finland was a defensive move which should not be seen or interpreted as a threat towards anyone, even if Russia inevitably wants to portray it as such. We should not see Finland's accession to NATO as a 180-degree turnaround, but rather see it as a continuation of our policy seeking to prevent war and enhance common security for all. And this also provides the answer to what kind of a NATO member will Finland and the Nordic countries want to be. Thank you.
Kiitos paljon. That was very good. And again, I'm sure there'll be questions, perhaps in the Q&A. But first, last, but certainly not least, it is my pleasure to introduce Anna Wieslander, Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council, Head of the Atlantic Council's Stockholm office, Chair of the Institute for Security and Development Policy, and Secretary General of the Swedish Defence Association. A lifetime member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences and the Swedish Society for International Affairs. She's the former head of the Speaker's Office in the Swedish Parliament, Secretary of the Swedish Defence Commission, and Deputy Director of both the Swedish Defence Ministry as well as the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Anna Wieslander, välkommen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be here, and I think it's the first conference I attend and speak to, where the map of Sweden is over there, and even the region where my family is from and where I grew up is outlined there, Småland, if you can see that down to the south. So I feel very much at home. Thank you for that. I will give this presentation based a very short version of of research I did and published in Defense Studies in 2021 on what I call the Hultqvist doctrine. And not all of you might know Hultqvist. Peter Hultqvist was the Swedish defense minister during this time, 2014 to 2022. So very crucial years. And he helped them to shape Swedish response, then not least, of course, to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. But I wanted to start a little bit earlier and just mention, as did the previous speaker here, that Sweden also abandoned neutrality when we joined the European Union in 1995 as a terminology to kind of define our security policy. And we called ourselves military non-aligned since then. I also want to say that Sweden's neutrality or non-alignment has never been treaty-based. It's been just a way of politically navigating as a small country up in the north. In 1809, we withdrew from great power politics, and since then we have been pursuing this policy, but it's not, compared to other countries, treaty-based. So before mentioning what happened in 2014, just a couple of years that are important, because already in 2009, Sweden adopted a security policy that outlined that Sweden was supposed to be able to take and receive military support from other countries. And given that we are military non-aligned, that was a pretty big obligation. We had a way of thinking already then, and it stemmed from the signing of the Lisbon Treaty in the EU with its Article 42.7 and the solidarity clause there, that we were not neutral, we were supposed to be active if something else happened around us. And for a traditionally neutral country, that is a shift, right? But we did not implement this very much because we did not see it as urgent. So the armed forces, for instance, were not tasked to do anything specifically to prepare to receive or take this military support, but we still had it in writing. Then in 2013 happened something that shook us up very much and kind of brutally awoke us already before Crimea, and that was what we called the Russian Easter. We had bomb attacks, Russia practicing bomb attacks just outside of the Swedish coast, and it was the Good Friday, and Sweden had no readiness to scramble those planes. So the Russian could perform these attacks, and according to NATO's annual report the year after, it was nuclear bomb attacks. And the Danes actually lifted their jet fighters to scramble, but at that time the Russians had already turned around and they were done with their exercise. But this, of course, sparked a very intense debate in Sweden on the readiness that we had at that time. And then in 2014, of course, this was all, the reaction was, as we've heard, very congruent among the Nordic countries. And the Hultqvist doctrine then began with three major components. First, focus on building deterrence and rebuilding national defense capabilities. And secondly, a patchwork, as I call it, of deepened bilateral arrangements, as well as enhanced partnership with NATO and the Nordics, but no security guarantees. Again, no treaty-based versions for Sweden. And then thirdly, a strong support verbally for the rule-based security order and a tough stance against Russia. Very clear that Russia had broken the European security order. And this was all described as the natural evolvement of non-alignment. which implies a long-term policy continuity. And I think that is partly part of politics and statecraft to kind of see that there is a continuum. But I take some time in this article and in my research to look at what kind of policy this actually was. Because if it was the natural involvement of non-alignment, you would have expected a lot of continuity from previous policy, that is being cautious in kind of addressing Russia or provoke any kind of feelings of that you provoke Russia, rather navigating carefully between great powers. Also restrictive on cooperation with others and to deepen cooperation in this situation. You have Switzerland not being part of the EU, for instance, and waiting a long time until they became part of the UN even. But this was not really what we saw here in Sweden. I think rather the Hultqvist doctrine and what Sweden did was to take several steps towards further integration into collective defense without applying for NATO membership already from 2014 and onwards. And you can see it in various dimensions. We strengthened the national defense and we built defense capabilities, although we started from a very low level, around 1% of GDP, and you know the NATO target for this year is 2% of GDP. Sweden was nowhere near that. So one could have foreseen that if we wanted to stay military non-aligned and not rely on others to help us, we would have to quickly increase defense spending in such a situation as we were in 2014. During the Cold War, the average was around 3.5% for Sweden to stay credible on defense assets. But we saw no such hints. There was an underlying assumption that Sweden was still part of something bigger and integrative. And you could say that it was a long-term ambition to increase defense spending rather than something that we jumped into. And then we also evolved with close cooperation with NATO, the US and Finland to levels that we have not seen before at all. During the Cold War, Sweden did have covert preparations with NATO and allies such as Norway, UK and the US. But that was so hidden that we had to have a formal investigation after the end of the Cold War to kind of prove that it had actually happened. While now this was very much out in the open, transparent, big exercises, NATO exercises, Americans coming in, bringing everything in and so on. So we kind of used the cooperation to signal very clearly to Russia that we were building a close cooperation with NATO together with Finland, I would argue. And we became closest partners to NATO, even preparing with plug-in mechanisms regarding communications and other things in case the graduate response planning for NATO was activated. We closed deals with the US and we did trilateral deals with the US, Finland and Sweden, all just in peacetime. So no guarantees, nothing like that, but with the logic that if we cooperated closely, someone would come to our help. With Finland, we did also from 2015 onwards planning for war, joint planning for war, but no security guarantees, no signs of signing of treaty. A continuity was, of course, the strong support for the UN Charter, rules-based international order. Most small states or smaller states or middle-sized states have that as their policy. So what we could see here was very much of integration when it comes to openness, when it comes to inclusiveness of others, and when it comes to comprehensiveness, both for peacetime preparations and even a little bit for war. and very little of screening mechanisms that you would have seen otherwise shielding Sweden from influence from other great powers or NATO as an institution. To the extent, which is interesting, that a state commission in 2016 said that Sweden had self-imposed limits on its ability to realistically uphold sovereignty even. Because we cooperated a lot, but we did not take the security guarantees. But that did not actually change anything domestically until the full-scale invasion of Russia. And just to mention what those domestic factors were that kind of kept Sweden in this integration policy without any attempts of joining NATO until 2022. I see it as the dominance of the Social Democratic Party in Swedish governance, where you wanted to have a little bit of both and thought that it was able to navigate that way, to keep it a policy that had served us well to stabilize, and that would hold also for the future. You had public opinion, also same as in Finland, around 30-35% higher than in Finland, but not 50 or over that wanted to join NATO. So that did not really drive it either. So you had national strategies from the past. You had a strong party dominating politics for many years that were not prone to join NATO, and you did not even have the public opinion for it. And therefore, I think an external shock of the things we saw in February 2022 was actually needed in order to cause a policy shift of that magnitude. So thank you very much.
Anna, tack så mycket. That was, again, excellent tour de force through Swedish defense stances indeed before, during, and after 2014. I have many of my own questions after those very thought-provoking contributions, but in the interest of time and allowing as many of you to be able to put questions to our esteemed panel here as possible, I will open up to the floor. So first we have these two gentlemen down there. Yes, absolutely. That's always the question, isn't it? Yes, it should be the red button. Yeah.
Łukasz Kulesa, Polish Institute of International Affairs. You may remember me from the morning session. A question to Ambassador Syse, because you ended with your last point about the support to Ukraine as long as it takes, and you left it hanging in a sense. But in case of Norway, I guess you are the person to ask, because I understand that you are responsible for coordination of the support, but also coordination of the work on this bilateral security agreement that would provide some kind of guidelines to what would be the cooperation in case of Norway. So if you could share more of this, I think that would be useful. Could I do another question?
I'm afraid that's all the time we have. So.
John Saropoulos from Al Jazeera again. What was the interpretation in Finland and in Sweden of the great delay from Hungary and Turkey in particularly allowing Sweden's membership application to go ahead?
And I think we can take one more question. If we have anyone with a burning question for our panel. All right, then I'll open it up to the panel to respond.
Does that mean that I start out? Sure. Very good. As they say, thanks for that great question. As a matter of fact, the Norwegian Parliament has committed itself to a 5-year program, going all the way into 2027 and probably beyond. But anyway, 2027. And we've even set aside about 7 billion euros to support Ukraine in various ways, militarily, financially, and otherwise. That is quite rare, as a matter of fact, because that commits next parliament as well, which I don't think has ever happened before in that sense. So that speaks to the commitment, I hope. And then the security guarantees agreement. Yes, absolutely. Finland too. We read the report now. A large number of states, and this stems from the, perhaps everyone knows, but still, the G7 summit last year, July last year, committed itself to having bilateral security guarantee agreements with Ukraine. And the Nordic countries, we who sit here, including Iceland, by the way, we joined that commitment in order to have security guarantee arrangements being made. The Norwegian document is about 12 pages long. It's quite detailed. We have built our agreement, of course we have, upon what was already have been committed by European allies, as well as the Nordic countries, of course. We copied you, Denmark. What does it say? Well, first and foremost, that we are committed into this 5-year period that I've already talked about. But this is a 10-year commitment. The Ministry of Finance said no to specify what the amount. But anyway, we are committed in the long run. And so are the G7 countries and all the Nordic countries too. So this security guarantees arrangements, which perhaps haven't been discussed here earlier on, pretty important.
You, if I understood you, you asked about our reaction to the Turkish delay of Swedish and Finnish membership. We never saw this as a Nordic problem, or even Sweden-specific, much less a Finland-specific issue. It was Turkish interior politics, Turkish NATO relations, Turkish-American relations. So that's why Finland never entered into, and here I maybe get a reaction from Sweden, but we never engaged in the same kind of bazaar discussions with Turkey that Swedes were felt obliged to do, and therefore it was over in a shorter while for us.
Yeah, well, yes, we had a longer journey to do. I think what came up already then in May 2022 when this came up from Turkey, it was Erdogan who protested, and my Turkish colleague at the Atlantic Council, she said, well, you know, it's all about the election. And I'm like, what election? When is it? It's next year in 2023. And I was just joking with me. No, he's planning his campaign, and it was so he took an opportunity, I think, to use this to drive some points on terrorism, the Kurdish issue, PKK, YPG, and as Erkki said, Sweden had more on that than Finland had, or more. Turkey had more issues with Sweden on that than on Finland, but. And in parallel, then came the F-16 deal with the U.S. So when the elections had passed and this had solved more or less, Sweden had fulfilled and Finland had fulfilled our obligations according to the trilateral agreement. The F-16s were still not sold with the U.S. That kept it. And then Hungary, I think, shadowed Turkey not to, so Turkey would not be alone in NATO, because then you're more a target that 28 allies ratify within 3 months and the rest 2 don't. And then in the end, it was about jet fighters as well, because Hungary wanted to buy 4 more jet fighters from Sweden. We don't really know all of that. It was much more vague with Hungary and much more concrete with Turkey, what they wanted.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our great panelists here for sharing their experience and thoughts. And they'll be around if you have further questions later. Thank you.